Here we go. We're going to do a little bit in chapter 10. We did some summarizing last week of the major points. Tonight, we're going to go back through and pick up specific aspects of some of those major points. So just to refresh ourselves a little bit, the highlights from the 3 chapters we looked at last week. Number 1, the overwhelming power of the experience for Daniel. That was in chapter 10, just this, somewhere between terrifying and I don't know what the other word would be, but a really terrifying experience, but also strengthening from this divine presence. So the experience for Daniel in chapter 10, the backs and forths, right? The vicissitudes of these 2 kingdoms and kings. The king of the south, the king of the north. And we are going to look in some detail at those backs and forths tonight. And then, but mainly everything points to God's sovereign eternal kingdom and the salvation of God's people. So faithfulness to God through these very difficult, trying times, right? To use the term that gets used in relation to biblical prophecy, to the time of tribulation. They're going through affliction, tribulation, difficulty, sorrow, and the message is hang on because God's going to get us through, and his will, his purposes will be accomplished. Now, I'd like to start, and as always, questions, comments, interruptions are welcome. If we don't get through everything that I prepared, which I kind of think we probably won't anyway, but I'm not worried about that. So, but we're not going to just reread these 3 chapters. We're going to look at a portion of chapter 1, and I want to focus on something we touched on last week, and that's this sort of spiritual warfare idea that's going on behind the scenes. So we have the historical events playing out, just like we would read the newspaper, this country's going to war against this country. We've got all that happening. And the vision, you might say, reports those events in a fairly straightforward way, especially compared to like chapter 9, chapter 8, where we get these visions of monsters and beasts and earlier statues and things like that. Now it's really about this king and that king and alliances they make and battles they have. It's less symbolic now, but still in the middle of this description of what we could say is like reading the newspaper, we have verses 12 through 14 in chapter 10 and then verse 20 in chapter 10. So let's read it. Verse 12. He said to me, so this angelic presence who comes to interpret Daniel's vision for him. He said to me, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. So we could go back to chapter 9, Daniel's confession, his pleading with the Lord to explain, to help him understand, his confessing the sins of his people and his own sins. So there's all that. And when he started that, this angelic presence we're meeting here now took off to come to him. God heard his prayer and sent the angel immediately. That's what it says in verse 12. But then verse 13, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me 21 days. Here we get a number. What does 21 mean? Are we talking 21 literal days? Are we talking somehow kind of symbolically? Don't know. Who's the prince of the kingdom of Persia? We're not really talking about just an earthly ruler. Although I do want to say chronologically, we are, as it were, we're going back to the time of sort of Persia's ascendancy. So if you think earlier in the book of Daniel, and if you go back to chapter 1, verse 1 of chapter 10, sorry, you see in the 3rd year of King Cyrus of Persia. So we're back in the kind of the historical setting is back in the 500s. Anyway, back to 13. The prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me 21 days. So Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I left him there with the prince of the kingdom of Persia doing battle, as it were, right? They're conflicting, competing. And I have come to help you understand what is to happen to your people at the end of days. And then verse 20. And when I am through with him, in the middle of verse 20, and when I am through with him, the prince of Greece will come, but I am to tell you the truth. There's no one with me who contends against these princes except Michael, your prince. Okay, now this is really, this kind of perspective is generally foreign to us in the modern world. Now that's what I'm trying to say is we in the modern world maybe have blinders on with regard to reality. You know, our reality tends to be what we can experience with our 5 senses. It's all right here. So I'd like us to kind of play with thinking about what if reality is bigger than we typically realize. And so like even reading the newspaper, there's more going on than just the circumstances and the personalities and all that. So I'm going to try to illustrate this with modern examples in just a minute. But anyway, let's look now to kind of get a feel for what we're talking about here. Look at Ephesians chapter 6. And I'm tempted to quote my father, God rest his soul and bless his memory. My dad used to say once in a while, he was a Methodist preacher, an old country preacher. My dad would say once in a while, I don't understand all I know about this. And that just really resonates with me. I often don't feel like I understand. You know, I've studied a fair amount. I know some stuff, but I don't really understand what I know. And I'm sort of thinking that way with some of the topics in the book of Daniel. Okay, Ephesians 6, verse 12. Somebody read that for us.
I'm reading from the King James Version. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places.
Good, okay, so authorities, powers, principalities. In my theological training, we talked quite a bit about structural evil. And there's a scholar named Walter Wink who's written about the powers. And there are, you know, he's basically doing a New Testament study of a handful of Greek terms that get at what is happening when groups of people sort of collectively see things a certain way, take action about what they see. And, you know, one kind of obvious example is what happens, and this is a negative one, of course, but what happens when a mob breaks out? It's like there's more going on. It isn't just that, you know, kind of cumulative, one person got mad and said something and then another person and then another person. No, there's something stranger going on, something more mysterious. That's the idea of structural evil. Now, where it gets, you know, more complex is, are there aspects to the reality of structural evil? You know, we could talk about racism or economic oppression, or we could kind of think like that, but is there more going on than just some people figuring out how to get a corner on power and whatnot, and sort of making life miserable for other people. Is there something more? Is there something beyond just people making choices? Something spiritual, something, sort of beyond the normal. That's what we're working on here. And that's what this verse says. Yeah, there are principalities and powers like that. Now let's look at Revelation 12, 7-9. Somebody read that for us.
Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him.
Okay, here's Michael showing up again, right? And Michael is known as one of the archangels. So, here is a picture of reality that says everything we experience in normal day-to-day life, everything we know about the world through our visual sense and otherwise, there's that. And then behind the scenes, interacting with our world, but also distinct from it, conflict is going on that is affecting what's happening in earthly life. Now, over the years, I've spent a lot of time with people that I would identify more in terms of like charismatic or even Pentecostal, where in those Christian communities, they're much more conversant about these things than people like me have been, right? Now, if you read, it's an interesting side note here, if you were to read John Wesley and Methodism in the 18th century, you'd see a lot more of what we might think of as kind of charismatic Pentecostal and this kind of spiritual warfare idea, very prominent. And frankly, in those communities, there's quite a bit more knowledge of these things, awareness of these things. Now, people like me always worry about extremes. So you can kind of get into these sort of crazy, spirit and demon behind every little thing. And we're casting out the demon of this and the demon of that. And I don't really think that's what the Bible's saying. What I am trying to say, though, is most of the people I hang around with, we probably could move that direction, right? There's something in the scripture that's saying more going on here than just whatever humans can concoct. And that's really worth thinking about. When we read the newspaper, that's worth thinking about. We don't have to draw lots of tight conclusions, but a new awareness. And again, I'm inviting any comment or question as we go through this.
So
All
do you think,
Yeah, go ahead.
so do you think that even today in our just daily lives, there's stuff going on spiritually behind the scenes that we don't know or understand or perceive? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and I think so. I don't know, other people in the room want to chime in here?
I believe you're right. I don't have an example right this minute.
Yeah, so my short answer is yes, and I'll give you an example from higher education. In another verse that I like to go to when I'm thinking about this topic is in 2 Corinthians 10, where Paul talks about our warfare is not against flesh and blood, but we're tearing down strongholds. We're taking every thought captive to Christ and working on a college campus, a stronghold, an intellectual stronghold, has a spiritual dimension to it. So this is a good example of where we could have demonic influence without necessarily all the weird kind of dramatic, head spinning kind of stuff, but a stronghold. So a campus develops an ethos, a kind of collective personality. And there are certain pronounced attitudes that, are very hardened toward the Christian faith. And even the mildest Christian witness of any kind gets severely criticized by vocal faculty. I mean, I've seen this numerous times. I've been on the receiving end of it, plenty. And this kind of unwillingness on their part to have a kind of honest, open conversation. No. So there's something that attitude is so entrenched and so powerful. People are afraid to say things. People are afraid. It's the fear and the confusion that's what I mean by the stronghold. Now, these people I'm referring to, they think they're doing the right thing, right? By engaging that way. They're trying to stamp out what they think of as stupidity, narrow-mindedness, hatred, bigotry. But what they're creating is an environment in which we don't really search for truth. We just have to line up behind the powerful faculty who say it's this way, right? That's a kind of stronghold that I think has demonic elements to it, even though I'm not saying anybody's demon possessed or anything like that. By the way, I think that happens in the church too. Where does the power take us? Who's in charge? What are we doing? And where's it taking us? Did I hear somebody? Okay. What am I showing you now? This is a sculpture on the side of Coventry Cathedral in the Midlands of the United Kingdom, Coventry Cathedral. I'm going to show you another photo in just a minute. That cathedral was virtually destroyed in World War II by Nazi bombs. This is a sculpture done in the 1950s and affixed to the side of the building. It's Michael the Archangel having vanquished Satan. So that verse we just read in Revelation, here is a bronze depiction of that verse. Now here's Coventry Cathedral, and you can see the angel there on the side of the building. But if you look at the left side of the picture, you notice, just kind of a shell of the building there. So they left part of the ruins of the old cathedral, which is a medieval cathedral. I think it was like a 12th century. I'm not sure about the year, but I think built certainly in the Middle Ages, I think 12th century. And then they built the new building onto the ruins. So, we could take some time and we could all go away and just think about this for a few minutes, right? This kind of and this cathedral is a place where they, thinking about what happened in World War II. And I'm going to get to this in just a second, a little bit more, but thinking about that, what they try to do at this cathedral, they have an ongoing program there of bringing very diverse peoples together to talk to one another for the sake of understanding. People of different Christian traditions, people of different faith traditions outside of Christianity, and the purpose is really just to understand one another for the sake of the Prince of Peace. So Christians are not, they don't have to change their beliefs to talk to people of other faith, and other people of other faith don't have to change their beliefs to talk to Christians. So nobody's watering down their faith, but they're coming together to try to create an environment in which peace and understanding can prevail. So this is this is a kind of spiritual battle going on, right? It's warfare, but it looks the opposite of what we think of as warfare.
Let's remind ourselves it's not.
And the visual effect of the building, to me, is really striking.
Part with his bare hands. The defendant claims that he acted in self-defense.
All right.
Yet he- Great.
This is a question I'd like us to kick around for a little bit. How do we think about what is often called spiritual warfare? So I've been talking here for a while. What's stirring in your minds?
Apply the tail-on grips besides the Major McIntyre's head sufficient pressure.
Right now, the global Methodist, Methodist Church is top kind of mind for me, and why it was a necessary next step. It's beyond I can't comprehend a current standing minister or person that can not believe in the resurrection
Yeah,
or the virgin birth
right.
and still be in standing.
Yeah,
And still, I mean, maybe they don't just come right out and say that, but how do you pursue this path without accepting the creed? I mean,
right.
so that is definitely a battle, and that's within the church.
Yeah.
That's just one of my thoughts.
Yeah,
Are you saying that the global Methodist Church doesn't believe that?
They do.
Or they're,
UMC, some, not
No,
the UMC, but some.
can everybody hear?
yeah,
Online, can you hear?
the global
Yes.
Methodist
Okay.
Church believes that is happening in the United Methodist Churches. And, it really shocked me. I went through a series with a pastor in Kansas City United Methodist Church. And learned a lot of stuff, and it was really exciting to go through it and listen. All to find out just actually this past year that he was one of the ones that is still high ranking in the church, but it doesn't believe in the resurrection. And I don't think that can be possible.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah, this is it's a,
well, I had two
Very
women
controversial.
yeah,
at United well, no, it's not UMW anymore. It's United Women of Faith telling me that the global church was lying about the Methodist Church was believing that,
well, and
and they were spreading lies.
there's a
Yeah.
lot of, when the fear is in place, there is a lot of misunderstanding, which, and that cathedral, that is an amazing thing.
yeah,
I will research that more.
yeah, it is.
That needs to
I don't know
happen
a lot
more.
about it, but it is, yeah. Yes, so
Have you been there?
I have not been
Steve?
there. No, I haven't been there. I've never been to, it's in Birmingham, which is northwest of London. Have you?
We visited Coventry Cathedral when we were there back in the 60s. I don't think it was that big a place at the time. And as I recall, when you walk through those front doors there, there's a charred cross or something that they also saved from the battle. And it just really is very striking and just kind of makes you just stand in awe of what happened and how they've used it.
Yeah. Okay, so the church controversy thing, I mean, to me, I think the principalities and powers are visibly at work in the confusion, the not just anger. People get angry and we have feelings, right? So it's not just people get angry, it's we then dig in and we characterize whoever we disagree with in a certain way. To me, that's where the real spiritual battle is happening. Now, I'm not minimizing what you're saying. I mean, it's, if we can't affirm the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, that's a major problem. And I mean, we can
Well, they're
talk-
not allowing you to say that to leave the United Methodist, become a global, but it is an issue.
Right, yeah. Okay, so that's an example of spiritual warfare, I think. Let me press on here, because I gotta get to some of the other stuff and, all right. It's very easy with topics like this. You know, back in the 40s, Hitler would have been the Antichrist, right? I mean, that's just would have been kind of obvious to people. And I think it's still fair to say Hitler really embodied the spirit of Antichrist, right? Not in the end time scenario way that it's often thought of. So here we have Hitler. We have anti-Semitism. We have influential German theologians, and I'll give you an example there, who began to argue that Jesus was not really a Jew, he was an Aryan, of the Aryan race. And so in the background in Germany, in very sophisticated, I mean, Germany epitomized academic standing and scholarship in this very sophisticated environment. High-ranking people began promoting the idea of a kind of racial identity, a pure race. And Jesus really wasn't a Jew, he was Aryan. Promoted by, like I have a set of theological dictionaries, using the New Testament Greek, edited by Gerhard Kittel. That was a big name in New Testament scholarship. Kittel got sucked into this German nationalism, German Christian nationalism, and helped to promote these anti-Semitic ideas, even though he himself was an expert in rabbinic literature, so again, how does that happen? How do these really smart people who say they're Christians wind up promoting what becomes eventually recognized as its own religion, and a false one, and an incredibly destructive one? So here we have, this is on the campus of UC Santa Cruz, excuse me. University of California, Santa Cruz. And this is a fairly mild one, death to Israelis. Sprayed on the wall of a building on campus. And if you're paying attention to the news, you've been hearing about these kinds of things. And again, we have legitimate protest. You can protest, Israelis protest their own government, on all kinds of things. So legitimate protest against what Israel is doing in Gaza right now. Legitimate. You can be very vocal about that. It so quickly turns into a kind of a Jew hatred that again is mysterious. How does that happen? We can't seem to keep it where it needs to be, right? Where there's legitimate criticism, prophetic word, maybe. No, it's that moves into this other area where it gets ugly and dark. How does that happen? Now, these are modern examples of real darkness in the world, a kind of hatred toward a group of people and calling them all kinds of names. And these are well-educated, sophisticated young people. Just trying to illustrate the sort of spiritual warfare that Daniel is telling us about, where Michael, the archangel, is going to battle with the prince of Persia. And I should have said earlier, it was widely understood in this day that each nation, each kingdom, I should say, each empire had the sort of patron deities with their forces that were doing battle with them on their behalf. So it's one kingdom going against another kingdom. It's one set of gods going against another set of gods. And in the Jewish tradition, the scriptural tradition, it's not a bunch of gods for Israel going to battle. It's God's heavenly court, God's angels going to battle. So it's a similar kind of idea, but not that, you know, we have monotheism in the Old Testament, so not a bunch of gods going at other gods. Spiritual battle. So this is from one of the scholars I'm using. He says, however we may attempt to define these forces that I've been trying to kind of illustrate, the truth remains that nations, like individuals and institutions, develop personalities of their own, which can be and frequently are at war with the divine will. I just feel like these are things thinking Christians need to be thinking about in these days, right? How do we follow Christ well in these days? And that includes within, you know, within our own denomination. All right. I've already said that, 10:1, the setting, we're moving back into this earlier period of time. Right? So the question is Daniel in the 500s having visions of what God is doing in the future? Or is the biblical writer sort of using Daniel's voice and Daniel's position to talk about what for the writer are contemporary issues? And there's no way of definitively concluding one or the other answers. And so the scholars, the careful scholars kind of try to keep these perspectives talking to each other and trying to think through what seems to be the most likely. So it can be dissatisfying not to come to a firm conclusion, but I think we should be careful.
I will not use this forum to comment on public policy.
And one thing about that, and I tend to repeat that, but it's probably both. It's both and. And what we see Daniel talking about in his contemporary, and then you can see totally applicable 300 years later, is it prophetic? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Does that mean that it's against his witness? No.
Right.
But it happened then, AD 70, probably very similar. I
Right.
mean, we can go through history and see the same thing over and over and over again.
Right. Yeah.
But we only see when it comes to head in war or something, it's always the lead,
Yeah.
just not in the newspapers yet.
Right. Right.
The defense requests that.
Okay, I'm gonna try to go through some details here and show you, basically to kind of give you an idea of where we're going. In chapter 11, we have basically, well, I've got the number, I can't remember the number right now, and I can't do the math quickly enough, but we've got like 12 or so verses covering more than 200 years. And then we've got twice that many verses covering about 12 years. If we stick with very specific historical references, and that's what I'm going to try to do here. So go quickly. So verse 2 of chapter 11, 3 more kings arise in Persia, then a fourth. And then a warrior king whose kingdom is divided to the 4 winds. So in those first couple of 3 verses, we get this kind of imperial history of Persia, and then the king of Greece, which we've touched on this already, Alexander the Great. He is the warrior king whose kingdom gets divided toward the 4 winds, and this is where we have these 4 kingdoms subsequent to Alexander the Great's empire. Verses 5 through 20 in chapter 11 is all this back and forth between the king of the north and the king of the south. And then starting with verse 21, really to the end of the chapter 11, that contemptible person who becomes a king, and eventually he's regarded as the king of the north, or named, referred to as the king of the north. So, in those verses, in chapter 11, we go from Cyrus the Great, that's in the middle 500s BC, to Antiochus IV in the middle, like in the 160s, 170s and 160s BCE. So that's a wide time frame. How do you pinpoint these references, the king of the north or the king of the south? So I'm gonna, following some of the commentaries that I'm looking at, we're going to identify these kings. And so this is where I'm asking you to bear with me with specific historical references. So these scholars have pinpointed, okay, and we'll look at the verse as we go through. So look at 11 verse 5. The king of the south shall grow strong, but one of his officers shall grow stronger than he and shall rule a realm greater than his own realm. Okay, who are they talking about? Well, most scholars working on this say Ptolemy I, those are his dates there, is the king of the south in verse 5. Also in verse 5, that commander who becomes stronger than the king of the south is, according to these the researchers, Seleucus I. He was one of Ptolemy's commanders who becomes ruler of the north, Babylonia and Syria. And you can see his date there. Okay, verse 6. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to ratify the agreement. Who are we talking about? So the commentaries think Ptolemy II, and you can see his date there. So we're jump about 50 years. Ptolemy II, and this is in the historical record, gave his daughter Berenice to Antiochus II. So the king of the south makes an alliance with the king of the north through a daughter. Now here's what happens that's kind of alluded to in the text, but not with this kind of detail. Antiochus marries Berenice after divorcing his wife. He has a baby with Berenice, divorces Berenice, and goes back to his first wife. In 246 BC, Antiochus, Berenice, and the infant child are all killed, assassinated, murdered. And that same year, Ptolemy dies. So Ptolemy II. So the king of the south, the king of the north, they're gone from the scene. All right, 7 through 9. In those times, a branch from her roots shall arise up in his place. The branch from her roots is Berenice's brother, Ptolemy III, king of the south. He takes territory in Seleucia from the northern king. So as it says here, he enters the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall take action against them and prevail. Okay. Then in verse 9, Seleucus II, as I say here, returns the favor. So you look at verse 9, then the latter shall invade the realm of the king of the south. Okay, then 10 through 19. Seleucus III, king of the north, rules briefly, just for 3 years there. And then Antiochus III, also known as the Great, because he reigns for a long time. You see his dates there. King of the north. He then invades the king of the south. So you read in verses 10 through 19 about this kind of activity. Ptolemy IV, who's the king of the south, defeats Antiochus III, but not for long. So if you read down, I may be getting ahead of myself. So I'll not try to explain, I'll just go on. So around 217 BC, that's taking place. Then in 203 BC, Antiochus III gives his daughter Cleopatra, and this is not to be confused with the more famous Cleopatra, gives his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V. So the northern king gives his daughter to the southern king, thinking that the northern king is thinking, my daughter will help me take this territory. Turns out she really loves her king husband, the Egyptian king, and she's loyal to him. And so Antiochus III is defeated in that effort. That sets him on a little bit of a rampage, and he tries to do things, particularly in the Holy Land, but he is stopped in verse 19 by this commander. These ships from Kittim. Which I can't get my eye on it right at this moment. But anyway, that's regarded as the Roman commander Scipio. So Antiochus III is defeated. I think that's 1119 or 1120, but I just can't get my eye on it. So now we go on to verse 20. Seleucus IV rules for 12 years. And he gets assassinated. And then we start with verse 21, the infamous Antiochus IV, who's the king who gets so much of the attention. So this is where we could go back to earlier chapters. And you know, we're sort of going back to this person that we've been talking about before. That's why I didn't do any more with that. Okay. From 323 BC to 175 BC in 20 verses, excuse me. And then from 175 BC with the beginning of the reign of Antiochus IV, from 175 BC to 164 BC, 24 verses in that chapter. Now, this is, you know, trying to kind of do the good biblical studies, pay attention here, right? So all those backs and forths about the king of the south and the king of the north, and they're constantly at it. What's the point here? Well, the author is summarizing history, but he's also showing the instability of these kings and kingdoms constantly trying to build their empires. He focuses, the scholars think, on Antiochus IV because the writer is writing during the time of Antiochus IV, and so he's witnessing these terrible things happening. You know, he stops the sacrifice in the temple, he desecrates the temple, he murders a bunch of Jews, he convinces some of the Jewish leaders to go along with the Hellenizing process that he wanted to go through. And so Antiochus IV gets a lot of attention because the author is writing from that contemporary perspective. That's what the scholars that I'm following are saying. Okay, this is very specific, right? I mean, I tried to give you the names of kings, and again, I'm looking at more than one source, so these are among the commentaries. These are sort of common references to the same kings of these countries. Now, here's another way of reading. And this is from John Goldingay. He says the narrative, the narrative that we just went through, the narrative shows a pattern of history. This is your point, Joanne, I think. And then he says, it is the story of the exercise of power, but the exercise of power only leads to external conflict, internal dissolution, or eclipse by a more powerful entity. The nature of kings is not to recognize this fact. They always aspire to the elusive final victory. And then I'm cutting out some of the quote, by marriage alliances, by force, but they fail. It may win famous victories, but the victories always turn out to be temporary. Now, that's his way, and he gets in to a lot of detail about how you could go hundreds of years earlier, back to Assyria, for example. The Assyrian Empire, and see some similarities in pattern, right? It may not fit as nicely as Daniel fits with the people that I've mentioned, but still, this pattern of history. A powerful ruler ascends, does a lot of damage, gets a lot of territory, is really famous and powerful for a while, sooner or later is brought to an end, and then it just repeats itself. Again, it's easy to think, well, those kings back then, but right? If we think about today, what's happening in our world today? You can think about Assyria, for example, or Syria, excuse me, which is never in the news anymore. There's terrible genocide in Assyria, in Syria. You know, Assad, isn't that his name, Assad? I'm blanking on his name. Yeah, he's powerful, right? And he wants to show people his power. The military junta in Myanmar, same thing, power. Okay. So wrapping it up here, I don't know how we're doing on time. Oh, gosh. Maybe we can chat a little bit, or we can quit early if you want to. Back to the spiritual warfare idea. And the conclusion of Daniel is Yahweh is always victorious over all attempts at usurping his goodness, power, and purposes, right? So that's we keep coming back to, I think, the lesson that Daniel really puts in front of us is stay faithful to God, he'll get you through. There will be suffering. It could be terrible, but stay faithful to God. He's going to get us through this.
Well, not only that, by his story, we also, although we are dealing with whatever the darkness, principality, whatever the Ephesians list is, but we also have beings, spiritual beings on our side.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
Michael is a warrior angel. He's a pretty good guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really think that takes practicing. I'll just talk about myself. I need practice incorporating that awareness into my thinking more. It's easy to get discouraged. You know, I can easily get discouraged about our denomination. And it's good for me to remember, you know, God isn't surprised by this. He's not defeated. Jesus is still Lord, you know, so, I mean, that doesn't make all the problems go away, but it does sort of pull me up out of the slough of despond. Okay, any other thoughts?
Well, I do have one question.
Yeah.
And it's a specific verse, and it's not terribly relevant, but the words caught my attention. It's in the chapter 11, verse 22. The overwhelming army will be swept away before him, both it and the prince of the covenant will be destroyed.
Yeah, thank you for that. The Prince of the Covenant, that shows up in a couple of places. So another thing I could have gotten into, and probably should have, I was sort of worried about too much detail and too much time, but so the Prince of the Covenant is probably the high priest.
Okay.
So the Prince of the Covenant is mentioned a couple of times, and Onias III, for example, is one of the high priests who is removed from office by the Seleucid king, and that there's intrigue and controversy within the Jewish community, because some of the priestly class are willing to go along with Antiochus to stay in power. So there's also that going on, and that's the Prince of the Covenant is a reference to the high priest.
So when these Antiochus, for example,
Yeah.
is he also over any of the Antiochus?
Yeah.
Is he also over Jerusalem
Yes.
and the temple?
Yes, yeah, and I should have said this too. So if you notice in chapter 11, the focus of the kings is always on the other king, right? The king of the north, king of the south. Israel is right in the middle of their fighting all the time. And so, these armies are marching through Israel one way, then they're marching through Israel the other way, and then there are times when they, when they are in power, then they're really treating the people of Israel very badly. Like we've talked about with Antiochus IV. So these poor people are right in the middle of it all the time. Any other thoughts, questions, anything I said that didn't make sense to you or that you'd like to disagree with?
Do you think it's the position of the Christian to be a citizen of God's kingdom and not get too pulled into the national auspices of things? In other words, our kingdom is heaven. It isn't United States. Or is it United States and then heaven?
Yeah, I really think this is a challenge for Christians at a number of levels, but in short, I would say, yes, I agree with you. So Christ's kingdom is over all, and he exercises power differently than any nation, kingdom that we know now.
But we're also to be good citizens. I mean, if you read Pauline
Right.
text over and over and over again,
Right,
we are to be the influence on a wider community.
right. Yeah, so Romans 13, submit to the governing authorities. Yeah, so Christians are, just by virtue of being alive on the earth at this time, United States Christians are citizens of the United States, and we are to be good citizens. I think it's perfectly appropriate to be patriotic. I love the United States. I remember, I may have told this story at some point, but after Joni and I lived in Italy for those years, we loved Italy. But when we came back to the States, it was 1984. And the Summer Olympics, 1984, Los Angeles. And my brother Dwayne and I went on a little camping vacation up in the mountains of New Mexico. And camping, of course, is not in a tent. We're in his really fancy camper, and he had a TV. So we're watching the Olympics on television. And here we are watching TV and the opening ceremonies, with the Olympic torch coming into the Coliseum in Los Angeles. And I started crying. It felt so good. We loved Italy, but it felt so good to be home. So I think Christians can be very patriotic. We just can't place our trust in an earthly ruler. And that's such a fine line sometimes, but I think it's a very important line. And the really most strident voices on the left and the right. So on the right, it's Christian nationalism. It's, white Christians. It's Christian nationalism. On the left, it's a different sort of identity politics. But they're very similar in that regard. And there are quasi-religious elements to these expressions that I think Christians really have to be aware of and pay attention to them.
Just as in Germany in the 30s, when you look at what Bonhoeffer went through, his confessing church, he had to separate. There are times when you do have to break fellowship.
Right.
But I'm reading a book now about church, and we should look at some book, but thinking about the churches in Germany with the swastika flags, and they believed they were doing the right thing.
Yeah, they believed they were doing God's will. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, the swastika on the altar next to the cross.
So is that a lot different from us having the American flag in our,
Well, that's a question. I think probably not, but it is a question, you know, I wanna have one foot in two places on that one. Yeah, I don't know, I mean, I'm certainly not bothered if there's not an American flag in the sanctuary. But I wouldn't say that I'm bothered that there is one either, so I may just be too.
well, I'll just say it's not a hill I would die on.
Yeah.
When we were in Europe, which was admittedly a long time ago, we traveled through, I don't know, 11 different countries, I think it was. And the one thing that I guess I came out of that experience with is that everyone feels about their country the way we feel about our country,
Mhm.
which made me a lot more tolerant of other people's views.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
And they should. I mean, if they don't, they should move. Really,
Right,
don't
right.
feel that way. You should find a place where you do feel that way.
Now, that's one of the things that's worrying me about college campuses now, some of them. And I saw this at SMU, and SMU is not really a school that's having these kinds of problems, but still, there's a kind of an animus toward the United States. You know, the United States is just inherently evil. And I think that's creating a kind of hopelessness among young people. You know, they may not say it this way, but I hate my country. But then what do I do, right? You know, not like I'm just gonna pick up and go someplace. So, yeah, I'm a little worried about some of those things right now.
Well, I'm still struggling with Israel and Gaza too, because I agreed Israel had a right to strike back, but it appears that they are committing genocide. It isn't just getting Hamas. They are killing off so many Gazans. It appears that they are committing genocide.
Yeah,
And that bothers me.
I think that's the question, whether they really are. Can we trust those numbers? I read an article today that the New York Times has now adjusted their numbers. Now, there's always unnecessary deaths, so I don't want to minimize that at all, but I don't know what to make of the numbers that get
We
reported.
read that yesterday in a different
Yeah.
publication.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is, we have to, it's war.
Yeah,
War is war,
yeah, it's horrible. It really is horrible.
but there are still people being kept in tunnels.
Yeah,
I mean, Americans.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a tough one. But this is it's a good topic to, Christians ought to be able to talk about this and not just split up and get mad and not talk to each other and all the other things that happen. That's where the spiritual warfare to me starts to kind of creep back in to the picture, or the principalities and powers, I should say. All right, well, I promise you, we're gonna get to what these numbers mean, and we gotta get to how. So the view that I've been following in teaching this book of Daniel is not the dispensationalist view. So how all this book of Daniel gets tied to the future yet ahead of us, and who the Antichrist is, and all that stuff, that gets spelled out in some detail in dispensationalist views. We're gonna get to that, and we're getting close. But I think we have a little bit more to do in chapter 12, and then we're gonna come back to some of these loose ends about what do these numbers mean, and how do we understand them, and all that. So
Will we meet a couple of times more?
probably, yeah. Yeah, I think chapter 12 next week, and maybe the beginning of what some of these numbers mean, and then if it spills over into one more week, yeah. Yeah. Okay, gang. We will see you.